He married her as a joke, an ugly beggar bought for a bet. But when she locked the bedroom door and whispered, "You don't know who I am," his blood ran cold. Because that night, beneath torn lace and silence, he discovered a truth that could ruin him forever. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow, we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. The rooftop of the Helix Hotel gleamed beneath a tapestry of stars, alive with champagne flutes, designer gowns, and the kind of laughter that echoed off marble walls and meant nothing. Jackson Hart stood at the center of it all, flawless, arrogant, and untouchable. His black suit fit like it was stitched from money itself, and his gray eyes flicked over the crowd with bored calculation. "Bill can't believe no woman's ever turned you down," chuckled Preston, one of his oldest friends and fellow heirs to their family's empires. "She wouldn't dare," another chimed in, smirking. Jackson raised his glass with a lazy smile. "Confidence is a currency. I happen to have a surplus." That's when Preston leaned in, slurring slightly from too much vintage cognac. "Then here's a real challenge, Hart. We bet $5 million. You can't marry the ugliest woman you can find in 48 hours. The crowd around them burst into laughter, some shocked, others amused. The bet was cruel, but in their world, cruelty was entertainment. Jackson tilted his head, unfazed. "And if I do?" "We wire you $5 million, no prenup, no annulment. A real marriage for 1 year," Preston declared, clinking glasses with another man. Jackson's smile was slow and cold. "Deal." No one believed he'd go through with it, until the next morning, when Jackson descended to the gritty streets just outside the hotel's private valet entrance. His luxury shoes crunched against broken glass and oil-stained pavement, a stark contrast to the silk-lined world he usually walked in. Then he saw her. Hunched on the sidewalk, Ivy was draped in rags, her face obscured by layers of mismatched scarves. Her figure was thin, almost fragile, and her hands clutched a small, tattered book in her lap. A paper cup with a few coins sat beside her. People walked by without looking. But Jackson stopped. "You," he said flatly. Ivy lifted her head. Her eyes, the only visible part of her face, met his. They were a deep, unnatural green, sharp, calm, and unreadable. She replied, voice steady, not at all like the cracked mutter he expected. "I want to marry you." A long silence followed. Jackson was already reaching into his jacket for the card his assistant had prepped with the civil registry details when Ivy spoke again. "Only if you promise one thing," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "You're making demands?" "One," she said softly. "Never ask me why." He blinked. "Why? What?" "Anything," she said. "Why I look this way, why I live like this, why I'm agreeing." "Never ask." Jackson studied her. He was used to power games, used to the desperate need to impress or manipulate. But there was no desperation in her voice, only quiet certainty. "Fine," he said. "Let's get this circus started." By noon that day, they stood in a sterile government office under flickering fluorescent lights. Ivy signed her name with a gloved hand. No guests, no music, just a bored clerk with a fading tie, stamping their license with a thud. Jackson's friends were already buzzing in group chats, screenshots flying. He hadn't told them her name or even taken a clear picture. Let them wait. When the clerk said, "You may kiss the bride," Ivy stepped back slightly. Jackson didn't move forward. They returned to the Blackhart estate that evening, a sprawling mansion outside the city, with black glass walls and a gate that screamed, "Keep out." Ivy followed quietly, her ragged clothing untouched, her scarf still covering half her face. The housekeeper, Rosa, stared at Jackson with disbelief when she saw Ivy. "Sir? Who's my wife now?" he said casually, like he was discussing the weather. "Give her a room." Ivy gently touched Rosa's arm. "No need. I'll stay wherever is empty." Rosa blinked, unsettled by her calm tone. Jackson showed her to a guest room, huge, minimalist, and cold. Ivy walked to the window first, pressing her hand against the glass. The garden below was perfectly manicured, too perfect. "The place doesn't feel real," she murmured. Jackson tossed a pillow onto the couch. "It isn't. It's a stage." He turned to leave, but something stopped him. Ivy had sat down at the edge of the bed, removing her shoes with slow, precise movements. She looked peaceful. Not pitiful, not afraid, just still. "Why are you so calm?" he asked, without thinking. Ivy didn't look up. "You promised not to ask." Jackson's jaw flecked, but he didn't push it. He walked out, slamming the door harder than necessary. In his private suite across the hall, he poured himself a joke. This was supposed to be a joke, a bet. He had expected tears, pleading, maybe even a tantrum. But this woman hadn't flinched, hadn't begged. She even thanked him. He drank, trying to shake the unease. Midnight came, and he couldn't sleep. Curiosity gnawed at him. He crossed the hallway barefoot and opened the door to her room. Ivy was asleep, curled beneath a blanket with her face turned away. The scarf had fallen slightly, revealing part of her cheek marked by deep burn scars that trailed down her jaw like a forgotten riverbed. Jackson froze, not at the scars, but at the calm in her sleeping face. She looked beautiful. Not in the way his models did, not the kind that could be photoshopped, but something raw, tragic, fierce. He stepped back, closing the door with a soft click. For the first time in years, Jackson Hart didn't know what game he was playing. He stood alone in the hallway, whispering into the dark. "Who the hell are you?" The next morning, sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows over polished marble. Jackson descended the staircase in silence, expecting to find chaos, or at least confusion. Instead, he found Ivy in the kitchen. She sat at the small side table, sipping tea from a chipped mug. Rosa stood near the counter, watching her as though unsure if she should offer help or keep her distance. Ivy looked up, eyes calm as ever. "Good morning." Jackson's brows lifted. "You're awake early." "I'm not used to sleeping in," she said simply. Rosa glanced at Jackson, as if silently asking, "Is she really staying here?" But Jackson said nothing. He just walked to the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter. Ivy didn't rush to fill the silence. She just sipped her tea again. "You're full of surprises," he muttered. "Are you?" she replied. "You kept your promise." He stiffened. "What promise?" "To never ask why," she said with a faint smile. Jackson studied her. She wasn't sarcastic or angry. She wasn't even trying to win him over. She was just present, undeniably herself, despite the absurdity of it all. "Did you thank me yesterday?" he asked. Ivy tilted her head. "Because you gave me a name again. You gave me something official, something I could hold on to. You could have said no." "I've said no to many things," she replied. "But this time, I wanted to say yes." He frowned. "You wanted to marry a stranger who saw you as a joke?" "You didn't treat me like a joke," she said, locking eyes with him. "Not when it mattered." That unsettled him more than he expected. He turned away, pretending to be distracted by the ticking of the wall clock. Later that day, the press caught wind of a sealed civil marriage document under Jackson Hart's name. Reporters scrambled, digging for a name, a photo, a headline. But there were none, because Ivy didn't exist in the public eye. No social media, no ID registered in the past decade, no address, just a birth certificate and a medical record buried deep in city archive. Jackson had the resources to dig if he wanted. But every time he considered it, he remembered her words. "Never ask me why." That evening, he returned to the guest suite and knocked once. "Dinner's ready." "I'm not hungry," came the reply through the door. He hesitated. "There's a private garden downstairs, quiet. You can eat there, no one will see." A moment of silence. Then the door creaked open. Ivy emerged wearing a long navy shawl that still covered much of her face, but her posture was straighter, more assured. She followed him through the halls in silence. In the garden, under lantern light and soft desert wind, they sat at opposite ends of a wrought iron table. Rosa had set out a light meal: rice, grilled vegetables, lentil soup. Ivy picked at the food slowly. Jackson barely ate at all. Finally, he asked, "Are you afraid of me?" "You don't frighten me," she said, meeting his eyes, "but I think you frighten yourself." He exhaled sharply. "You talk like a psychologist." "To talk like someone else," she whispered. "I still remember how." Silence settled between them, the kind of silence that asked questions neither was ready to answer. He leaned back. "You don't belong here." "You're not leaving either." She shook her head. "Not yet." She stared into her soup, then looked back up, because sometimes even a joke can become something more. He didn't know what that meant. Didn't want to. But when he returned to his room that night, he didn't turn on the TV. He didn't open his laptop. He just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the city lights in the distance. For the first time in his life, Jackson Hart couldn't tell if he had won the bet or started losing something he couldn't name. Jackson Hart didn't even glance at Ivy as the car rolled through the wrought iron gate of his estate. The mansion loomed like a fortress carved out of old pride, cold, extravagant, untouchable. It matched the man perfectly. Ivy sat quietly beside him in the back seat, her face still obscured beneath that heavy gray scarf, her hands folded over a borrowed purse. She hadn't said much during the ride back from the... She didn't ask questions, she didn't look impressed, and that, somehow, irritated Jackson more than any tears or begging would have. He ordered the butler, Hastings, to show her to the furthest guest room on the west wing. "Treat her kindly," he added dryly, the corners of his mouth twitching. Hastings, an older man who'd worked for the family since Jackson was a boy, gave a small nod and gestured for Ivy to follow. She walked with grace, too much grace for someone who was supposed to be broken. Jackson went to his study, poured himself a drink, and tried to forget the ridiculous stunt he'd just pulled. A $5 million joke. His friends probably hadn't stopped laughing since the moment the wedding certificate was stamped. He had married a beggar, a woman so covered in fabric and silence that her identity was as much a mystery as her past. He didn't go to see her that first night, or the next, or the one after that. But something odd happened during those days of avoidance. The mansion began to change. The head housekeeper whispered that fresh-cut lavender had appeared in vases that had been empty for months. The cook swore someone had organized the pantry better than any of the staff had managed in years. The gardener reported someone had weeded the old earth plot behind the kitchen without ever being seen. And there was always humming, saunting melodies that drifted through the halls late at night like lullabies from a forgotten child. One afternoon, Jackson returned from a board meeting early. As he walked past the long glass windows of the study, something caught his eye. Down in the courtyard, by the stone fountain, Ivy knelt beside a small brown bird with a mangled wing. She wasn't crying or panicking, just humming that same strange tune as she gently wrapped the creature in a torn handkerchief. She carried it to a shallow basin of water and whispered something too soft for the wind to carry. Jackson watched from behind the curtain, frowning. That moment stayed with him long after the day faded into dusk. That, and the words Hastings had muttered while passing him in the hallway. "It's not what she seems." What did that even mean? The next day, Jackson gave up pretending he didn't care. He asked for reports, quiet ones, nothing official, nothing traced, just simple answers. Who was Ivy? Where had she come from? What had disfigured her? But there were no records, no fingerprints, no social security number, just a woman with no past and eyes that sometimes caught the light like glass about to crack. He began observing her more. Not openly, never directly, but in stolen glances, through windows, from balconies, reflected in silver trays. Ivy rarely spoke unless spoken to. She spent most of her time in the gardens, tending to the forgotten patches of green Jackson had long abandoned. The staff adored her. Even the usually grumpy chauffeur found himself smiling when she asked about his late wife's rose bushes. But Jackson didn't understand it. Why wasn't she angry? Why wasn't she demanding his money, his time, his name? She had won a bet worth millions. She had every legal right to live like a queen, and yet she acted more like a ghost who had found a home to haunt. The confusion festered. One evening, Jackson had enough. Storm clouds rolled outside, and thunder cracked against the stained glass windows of the mansion. He stalked down the hallway toward the west wing, his footsteps echoing like war drums against marble. He didn't knock. He shoved the door open. Ivy was seated at a small writing desk, her back to him, surrounded by soft candlelight and the scent of lavender oil. She didn't startle. She didn't even turn. Jackson's voice was low, almost shaking. "Take it off." She paused, her fingers still on a piece of folded paper. "Take off the scarf," he said, louder now. "I want to see who I really married." A long silence passed between them. She slowly turned to face him, her eyes unreadable behind the shadows. "You don't want the truth tonight," Ivy said softly. That answer should have infuriated him. It should have sparked the same arrogance that had led him to gamble away a vow in the first place. But instead, something in him stilled. He backed out of the room. And for the first time since their strange union, Jackson Hart found himself more afraid of the truth than of the unknown. Clyde's sleep didn't shake that night. Not really. He paced the length of his study, his glass untouched on the side table, the decanter still open. Outside the storm had passed, but something heavier lingered in the mansion air. He couldn't shake her voice from his mind. Low, calm, utterly assured. "You don't want the truth tonight." What kind of beggar speaks like that? By dawn, he stood at the edge of the garden, shirt wrinkled from sleep he never took. Below, Ivy moved barefoot across the dewy grass, her scarf still tightly wrapped around her face, the same layered fabric as always. She knelt at the base of the olive tree that had never borne fruit. Her hands were steady, purposeful. She planted something he couldn't see, a seed maybe, or a prayer. When she rose, she looked up toward the house. For a breathless second, her eyes met his through the open window. He didn't duck, didn't hide, but her gaze, quiet, knowing, left him feeling exposed anyway. Later that morning, he cornered Hastings again. "You said she's not what she seems," Jackson said. "Explained." Hastings hesitated. "I'm not sure I can, only that I've served this family for over 4 decades, and I've never seen someone mend this house like she has. Not with money. With silence." Jackson didn't respond. He found himself returning to the courtyard later, retracing her steps. The bird she tended to was gone, but beside the basin sat a tiny folded cloth, a bundle of fresh herbs tied with twine, a gesture meant for no one. Or maybe just for the home itself. That afternoon, one of the housemaids brought him something. "I found this tucked in the linens, sir," she said, holding out a scorched scrap of paper. "It must have fallen from the laundry basket." Jackson took it. It was part of an old photograph, half-burned. A child with a crooked smile. A house behind her, now blackened at the edges. And in the corner, barely visible, were the words, "If it ever finds you again, run." He stared at it for a long time. That night, he couldn't help himself. He returned to Ivy's room. She was seated again at the desk, this time writing with a worn fountain pen on thick paper. The candles cast shadows across the floor like moving lace. He stepped in slowly, more measured now. "I'm not here to demand anything," he said. "Just a conversation." Ivy looked up, her hand pausing mid-sentence. "That's new," she said softly, then gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." He did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, but not hostile, just careful. "You confused me," Jackson said at last. "You didn't flinch when I mocked you. You didn't ask why. You don't act like someone who's lost." Ivy set her pen down. "Because I've already been lost. What you did, it wasn't the worst thing that's happened to me." He blinked. "You sound grateful." I am, she said simply. He stared at her scarf. Even for this farce of a marriage? Especially for that. His hands curled into fists. Why? She didn't answer at first. Then she said, because, even in mockery, you gave me a door out. He wanted to ask more, wanted to peel back her layers like an onion until the truth spilled out. But something stopped him. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and set the photograph scrap gently on the desk between them. Who is she? He asked. Ivy looked at the charred photo. Her fingers trembled, just once, before she folded the paper over and tucked it back into the desk drawer. She's no one now, she said. She was someone who survived something terrible, and someone who learned to hide. Jackson leaned forward, voice low. Are you hiding from someone? A beat. Then Ivy smiled faintly. Not anymore. He didn't press further. He only watched as she returned to her writing, and when he stood to leave, she said one last thing. You may have married me for a bet, Jackson, but what you got was something you didn't bet on. He left her room quietly that night. And for the first time since the day he marked fate, Jackson's heart began to wonder if he had stepped into a story far older and far more dangerous than he ever intended. Jackson Hart stepped out of the limousine, the echo of laughter still lingering in his ears, but it did little to numb the storm brewing inside. The charity gala had been a parade of forced smiles and whispered rumors, whispers he couldn't silence. All night people had asked about the wife, their curious gazes laced with subtle mockery. And when he answered with a smirk or silence, they'd exchange looks. The moment he entered the mansion, the butler offered to take his coat, but Jackson waved him off. The liquor throbbed behind his eyes, and every step through the marbled hall felt heavy. Upstairs, faint humming floated from the east wing. Ivy's room, that same lullaby. Always the same haunting tune. He found her kneeling in the hallway near a small potted plant, humming softly while repotting it. Dirt smudged her fingers. Her scarf was still tightly wrapped around her face, covering everything but her eyes. She looked up as he approached. Home late, she said gently. Jackson's jaw tightened. Did you enjoy your quiet evening while I was being laughed at by the entire elite of Manhattan? To read tabloids, Ivy replied, standing slowly, with teeth in neck. Because apparently, you're the new joke they're whispering about, the billionaire and the beggar. Congratulations, Ivy. You made it. She didn't flinch, not even a blink. You made the choice, Jackson. I didn't ask you to marry me. He scoffed, eyes blazing. You didn't ask, but you accepted. Don't pretend you didn't benefit. Ivy tilted her head, studying him with unsettling calm. Benefit? From what? From hidden, mocked, pitied? You think this life is a reward for me? He turned away, pacing. You're not even angry. I bring you into this palace as a joke, and you act like it's a monastery. You clean, you water plants. What kind of person just accepts being treated like a joke? Ivy stepped forward. Her voice was lower now, tinged with something deeper than anger. Because I've lived through worse than being laughed at, Jackson. Marguerite doesn't burn like fire. He froze. She walked past him, slow and deliberate, into the grand mirror-lined sitting room, the one he never used. She stood before the tall gilded mirror, looked at her reflection, and began to unwind her scarf. I told you once not to ask for the truth at night, she whispered. But since you insist... Jackson's breath caught as the layers of fabric fell away. First the outer scarf, then the tighter wrap beneath. When the last piece dropped, the room held its breath. Her face, once shielded from the world, revealed the truth. Inside was a tapestry of scars, twisted and deep, the texture of melted wax. Her cheekbone was uneven, her jaw marred by past trauma. But her eyes were untouched. Stunning, emerald green, fierce and unyielding. Fire, she said calmly, still looking at herself in the mirror. Started in a house that was supposed to be my home. Jackson couldn't speak, his throat closed. Ivy continued. There was a man once, a man who said, I was beautiful. who said I belonged beside him on every campaign stage. He was powerful, wealthy, adored by the media. But when a scandal threatened his image, he decided I was better buried. Flashback. Ivy, in a white gown, standing beside a young, charming man at a political gala. Cameras flashing. Whispers about misused funds. A breaking news alert. Senator Armand linked to embezzlement. After fire. I've survived, Ivy said softly. Barely. I ran, changed my name, disappeared, until you found me sitting outside a hotel, hiding under rags. Jackson finally stepped forward, voice hoarse. Ivy, I didn't know, she said, turning to face him fully. You didn't ask. You never asked who I was, just like him. You only wanted to win a bet. The room spun for Jackson. The liquor now felt like acid in his veins. He sat down, hard, on the edge of the velvet couch, staring at the woman he had thought was beneath him, and realizing she'd lived 100 lives deeper than he ever had. I don't know what to say, he murmured. There's nothing to say, Ivy replied. You were never meant to see the ashes. She turned and walked out of the room, scarf still lying on the floor. Jackson didn't follow. He couldn't. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows, casting soft red and gold patches across the silent hallway. Jackson sat at the long dining table, untouched coffee in front of him, still in the same clothes from the night before. The scarf Ivy had left behind rested in his hands, delicate, worn, faintly scented with lavender. He hadn't slept, not a second. Her words had burrowed into his skull, deeper than any insult he'd ever received in his cutthroat world of billion-dollar deals. You were never meant to see the ashes. She hadn't meant her scars. She meant the wreckage of her trust. Scorched, fragile, and hidden beneath her quiet grace. He stood abruptly, pushing away from the table, and stormed into the library. Dozens of portraits of his ancestors lined the dark wood walls. Blackwoods, who conquered industries, won wars, signed treaties. All of them had the same expression. Aloof, cold, unbothered. He hated them all. Sir, came the soft voice of his butler, Malcolm, standing at the doorway. There's something I believe you should see. Jackson blinked. What now? Malcolm handed him a sleek silver tablet. The internet, sir, it's begun. On the screen were headlines, bright, vicious, and multiplying by the hour. Billionaire marries disfigured woman for $5 million. 0 cents bet? Wife of Jackson Hart identified as mysterious burn victim. Cruelty or charity? Public divided over viral marriage scandal. And stomach dropped. You muttered, who leaked this? We're investigating, Malcolm replied. But the narrative is spreading fast, and not in your favor. Jackson scrolled further. Video clips from the rooftop party, blurred shots of Ivy entering the civil office, speculative footage of her from weeks before, humming in the garden, her face hidden behind scarves. A side-by-side comparison with old footage of Senator Armand's missing fiancée. Ivy never told anyone, Jackson whispered. She didn't need to, Malcolm said quietly. Someone followed the trail once they saw her face. Jackson ran both hands through his hair, pacing. We need to stop this, control the narrative. Issue a statement? She's gone, Malcolm said, and Jackson froze. Next morning, the maid went to bring her breakfast. Her room was empty, the window open. The scarf, gone. Jackson bolted from the room and sprinted down the hall toward the east wing. Ivy's room was bare, her few clothes gone. On the pillow lay a single envelope. His name was scrawled on the front. With shaking fingers, he tore it open and unfolded the letter. Jackson, don't look for me, not because I hate you. I don't. But you were never meant to see what I truly am, what I survived to become. This wasn't your burden, and I will not become your redemption. You gave me a name back, even if it started as a joke. But now it's time I give it meaning, on my own terms. He stood there for a long time, letter trembling in his grip. The silence of the mansion pressed against him like a punishment. He thought of her humming, of her tending the garden, of her whispering to the broken-winged bird like it was family, of her face scarred and beautiful and unafraid. He had taken everything for a game. Now he had nothing but the truth. Hours later, a meeting in his boardroom felt more like a funeral. Executives stared at him, silent and expectant, as the PR manager outlined the crisis. Footage is going viral. The narrative is brutal. You're being painted as a cold-blooded elitist who exploited a vulnerable woman. Sponsors are pulling out, shareholders are rattled, our image is tanking. Jackson sat still, eyes blank. I deserve it. The PR manager blinked. Excuse me, sir? Peter didn't hold back a sigh. I said, I let the world treat her like a mask, and I never asked who she really was until it was too late. Someone coughed awkwardly. The head of legal leaned forward. Should we prepare a legal statement denying? Jackson said, You're going to help me write a different statement, one that tells the truth. She was never a beggar, he said. She was never weak. I was. I just didn't know it until she left. That night, Jackson walked out to the garden. Her garden. The flowers she planted were still blooming, neat rows of jasmine, thyme, and desert roses. The broken-winged bird's nest was empty now, healed and flown. Moonlight caught the corners of a tattered notebook she'd left behind on the bench. He picked it up. Inside were pages filled with sketches of the mansion, of the bird, of the staff smiling, of him asleep on the couch. She'd seen him differently. And in the final pages, a drawing of a fire, a woman walking through it barefoot. Below it, in small script, ashes are not the end, they are the proof we survived. Jackson sat on the bench and whispered into the night, Ivy, come home. But the wind only answered with silence. Jackson Hart stood in the middle of his silent mansion, the cold marble beneath his feet offering no comfort. The note Ivy left still trembled in his hands, its ink smudged from the rain and his restless fingers. He had read it a dozen times, yet each word felt heavier than the last. Don't look for me. You weren't meant to see the ashes. But he was looking. He hadn't slept in days. Cameras, emails, phone calls, he scoured every trace of Ivy's existence. Her clothes were gone, so was her sketchbook from the conservatory. She'd erased herself so completely, it chilled him. All that remained was a pale yellow scarf, caught on a rose bush in the garden, as if the wind itself had mourned her leaving. Jackson sat down at his desk and pulled up the estate's security footage. Frame by frame, he watched her leave calm, deliberate, unnoticed. Even in departure, Ivy moved like a ghost, barely brushing the air. She had disappeared without a ripple, and he was left drowning in her absence. He contacted hospitals, shelters, soup kitchens. He even sent private investigators into the streets, dressed down and discreet. They returned with nothing but apologies and blank expressions. She's gone, one muttered. Some people don't want to be found. But Jackson refused to believe it. Not after what he'd seen in her eyes that night. Truth, pain, courage. The way she looked at him when she revealed her scars and the way she turned away. He had failed her, yes, but she hadn't disappeared from malice. She vanished from protection. He was the threat. His mother's voice cut through his haze one night like a blade. She stood in his study, her expression steely, her designer coat soaked from the rain. You broke something rare, Jackson, she said, looking around at the lifeless mansion. And you're arrogant enough to think your money can fix it. I didn't mean it, he began, but she silenced him with a glance. No, you never mean, you do. Carelessly, brutally, and this time the damage wasn't just to your reputation. She walked to the window, where the garden lights flickered dimly. There was light in her, even through the mask, and you crushed it with your pride. The silence that followed was heavier than any scolding he'd received in his life. He was more than a bet. More than a wife, she whispered. She was a mirror, Jackson, and you shattered her, because you couldn't stand to look. That night, he sat alone in Ivy's old room. It still smelled faintly of lavender and rain. The bed was made, untouched since her departure, but on the nightstand sat something he hadn't noticed before. A small notebook wrapped in twine. No name, no note, just simple, worn leather. He opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were letters, pages upon pages, addressed to someone named Lila. Jarish Alaya, I met someone today. He looked at me like I was an accident, but didn't flinch when I asked him to promise not. Dear Lila, the mansion is cold, but the garden is kind. The roses don't stare. Dear Lila, sometimes I pretend you're still beside me, that the fire didn't take your laugh, that I'm still someone you'd recognize. Each page cut deeper. Ivy's words weren't just memories, they were wounds, still bleeding ink. This was her soul, laid bare, never meant to be read by a man like him. And yet, as the tears blurred his vision, Jackson read on, desperate to understand the woman he had turned into a spectacle. The last letter was the most fragile, a simple line beneath a sketch of two girls dancing in the rain. Anyone ever finds this, tell him, beauty isn't something you buy, it's what survives the fire. The next morning, Jackson left the mansion behind. He traded tailored suits for a plain jacket, luxury cars for unmarked rides. His staff stared in shock, but he gave no explanation. His board called repeatedly, investors threatened to walk away. But he didn't care. He had money, yes, but what did it mean if the only person who looked at him like he was human had walked away? He wandered the old neighborhoods, first near the soup kitchen where he'd first seen her speak to a lost boy. He found the same volunteers. They shook their heads when he asked for her, but one of the women, an older nurse with kind eyes, pulled him aside. She left something in the reading room, the woman said, handing him a cloth bag. Said someone would come for it one day. I didn't expect it to be you. Inside was a cracked music box shaped like a ballerina. When he turned the key, it didn't play, but beneath the velvet lining, he found a note in Ivy's looping script. Some dances end in fire, but some begin again, in rain. It was a riddle, or maybe a clue. He expanded the search to coastal towns. Ivy had mentioned the sea once, in passing. Salt air hides the sound of grief, she'd told a housekeeper during her first week in the mansion. He remembered that line now like a prophecy. In a quiet village by the cliffs, he found her. Not directly. First he found her name, Ela, on the payroll of a small inn near the water. Then he found Whispers, a woman who never smiled but once saved a child from drowning, a woman who hummed to the tide and walked barefoot in the garden. It was raining when he arrived. And he didn't bring flowers. He brought the music box, and the notebook, and the scarf that once caught in the roses. He stood in the courtyard of the inn, soaked to the bone, as a door opened slowly. She stood there, hair damp, face pale, eyes wide. Jackson didn't speak. He knelt. The rain pooled around him, soaking into his clothes and the earth, as if the sky itself bowed beside him. Heidi, he whispered, you were never the bet. I was. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her eyes filled with something between sorrow and disbelief. He didn't rise. Didn't beg. Didn't justify it. He only held up the notebook with trembling hands, the pages protected by a wrap of plastic, and said, I read every letter. I know about Lila. I know about the fire. And I know I don't deserve anything from you. But I had to come. I had to see you choose. Ivy turned away, her shoulders shaking. The storm raged louder. And when she finally spoke, it was not with venom, but fire. Then prove it, she said without looking at him. Burn the money. Jackson stood in the rain outside the small coastal inn, his soaked shirt clinging to his skin, his knees pressed into the gravel. The flickering porch light above him cast a pale halo, illuminating the desperation etched across his face. Ivy stood in the doorway, arms crossed tightly over her chest, a fresh bandage across her shoulder where she'd been injured, rescuing the child. Her eyes were uninscrutable, nor cruel, just tired. You were never the bet, Jackson said again, voice hoarse. I was. The storm above mirrored the storm inside him. Ivy didn't move. For a moment, the only sound between them was the wind twisting through the narrow streets. Then she whispered, "Then prove it." Jackson's breath caught. "Anything?" "And muddy." She said it so quietly he almost missed it. But when the words settled in his chest, they hit harder than any insult, harder than the public backlash, harder than even the shame he'd carried since she vanished. "I gave the winnings to a burn foundation," he said. "Under your name." Ivy blinked. "I didn't do it for praise. I didn't announce it. I didn't even ask for a receipt," he said, stepping forward, eyes never leaving hers. "I just wanted something good to come from what I destroyed." "You didn't destroy me," she replied. "I was already ash. You just touched what was left." Jackson lowered his eyes. "But I saw the ember still burning, and I stomped on it. That's on me." She turned away then, heading back into the inn. For a second, he thought she was walking away again, but then she paused, hand resting on the doorknob. "You want forgiveness, Jackson?" He lifted his gaze. "Gonna swallow you." "Then stop performing. Sit in the ashes with me." And with that, she disappeared inside. The next morning, he didn't leave. He rented the last room at the inn, a modest space with peeling wallpaper and a narrow bed. He didn't chase her, he didn't beg, he simply existed, in her world, quietly. He helped serve breakfast to guests. Cleaned dishes. One morning, the innkeeper's elderly father taught him how to bake bread. Ivy didn't speak to him for days, but she saw him painting potatoes, scrubbing steps, even bandaging a child's scraped knee. And slowly, something shifted. One afternoon, she caught him sitting under the almond tree behind the inn, flipping through her old notebook, the one filled with letters to her sister. "I read it," she said from behind him. He stood, closing the notebook gently. "Only one, the one you wrote after the fire." Ivy hesitated. "Then you know what I lost?" "You," he said, "and I won't pretend to understand that kind of pain. But I know what it's like to lose yourself, to become the thing people say you are." She stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "And what do they say you are?" "A monster, a playboy, a cold-hearted heir with too much money and too little soul." And what he took a breath. "I was, but then a woman walked into my life wrapped in scarves and silence, and she didn't ask for anything except to be left alone, and I couldn't do it, because something about her made me want to be more." For the first time in weeks, Ivy's lips trembled, not from fear, not from anger, but from the weight of a truth too long buried. "I don't need saving," she said. "No," Jackson whispered. "I'm the one who needed it." They stood in silence, wind brushing between them like a fragile thread. Then Ivy asked, "Do you still have the marriage certificate?" He reached into his coat pocket and handed it to her, creased and rain-worn but intact. She looked down at the paper. "Why haven't you annulled it?" "Because it's the only thing I've done in my life that wasn't about me." Ivy looked up. "And what now?" He didn't flinch. "Now, I ask for your permission to stay, not as your husband, but as your guest, as someone who wants to learn how to live without masks." Tears shimmered in Ivy's eyes, but they didn't fall. She handed the certificate back. "Then we start with truth. No secrets, no bets." Jackson nodded. She turned away again, but not in retreat. She walked back toward the inn and left the door open behind her. For the first time since their wedding, he crossed a threshold not as a conqueror, but as a man finally choosing to stand still. Weeks passed. Jackson began helping the inn's owner with repairs. Ivy, still cautious, resumed her quiet routine, tending to flowers, teaching local children how to read in the afternoons, and helping cook for the fishermen at dawn. He learned how she liked her tea, 2 sugars, 1 splash of milk. He found her singing to herself sometimes when she thought no one was listening. And he started writing letters, not to her, but to himself. Letters full of things he wished he'd said before. One day, he handed her one. It read, "I never asked what your favorite flower was. I never noticed the way you curled your fingers when you were nervous. I never stopped to think that love wasn't something you buy, but something you offer, piece by piece, with trembling hands." I see you now, Ivy. And below it, just one line. If you'll let me, I want to become someone you'd choose, not someone who chose you out of cruelty. She didn't speak for a long time after reading it, but that evening she made tea and placed 2 cups on the table. One for her, and one for him. The town knew their story. Whispers drifted through markets and bakeries. Some still stared, some disapproved. But no one dared disrespect Ivy, not after she saved that drowning girl. Instead, people began nodding, offering smiles. A fisherman gifted her a shell necklace for her bravery. A child painted her a portrait. Life didn't rush, but it grew. Logan sighed. A feeling of uselessness settled. One night, as the sea breeze curled through the open windows, Jackson and Ivy sat beneath the stars. "Do you regret marrying me?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, "I regret the reason, but not the fact." He turned to her, lips parting to speak, but she raised a hand. "Not ready for vows again," she said gently, "but I am willing to see who you become." He exhaled. That was more than he deserved. And perhaps just enough to begin. The television studio lights were harsh, but they didn't mask the tremble in Jackson Hart's voice as he stood before the nation, no longer a titan of industry, but a man exposed. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he began, his usually unshakable voice cracking. "But maybe she deserves the truth?" Across the screen behind him, a single image appeared, one the media had never seen. It was Ivy in the garden, her scarf off, her burns visible but softened by the glow of sunrise. Jackson had taken it quietly, weeks before she vanished, never intending to show anyone. Until now. "I married a woman to win a bet," Jackson confessed, voice breaking. "A cruel, vile bet. I thought I was proving something to the world, but in the end, I only proved how hollow I'd become." Reporters stopped scribbling. The audience behind the glass stared. Jackson's eyes were red. "Her name is Ivy, and she is stronger, kinder, more human than anyone I've ever known. I made a joke out of her pain, and for that I am ashamed." Then he looked directly into the camera. "I'm donating $5 million, the full amount of the bet, to the Burn Survivors Foundation. In her name, because the world needs to see her. Not what I did to her, but what she rose from." Somewhere, in a modest room above a coastal inn, Ivy stood frozen before the television, a dish towel clutched in her hands. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the sea beyond the open window. Ivy's co-worker, Lena, peeked in from the hallway. "Ivy, that's him, isn't it?" Ivy didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the screen. Jackson's voice continued, softer now. "I don't expect her to forgive me, but I needed the world to know she wasn't the punchline. I was, and I still am, until I earned the right to stand in her light." The screen faded to black. Ivy sat down slowly on the bed, her heart beat loud in her chest. For weeks she had been building walls. Solid, high, necessary, but one by one, they trembled under the weight of what she'd just seen. That night, the inn's kitchen hummed with the scent of baked bread and tomato stew. Ivy busied herself with chopping vegetables, trying to pretend her chest wasn't aching. When she stepped out with trays, she found Jackson there, up to his elbows in soapy water, humming a lullaby she'd forgotten anyone else knew. The sight made her drop a spoon. He looked up, startled but didn't speak. "I didn't ask you to come here," Ivy said, her voice tight, not trusting the tremor in her bones. "I hope. I know. Then why are you still here?" Jackson paused, drying his hands slowly. He didn't look at her when he answered. "Because the man who walked away from you, that man died the night you disappeared. I've been looking for pieces of him ever since. And they all led here." Ivy's throat tightened. She turned away, her breath shallow. She wanted to scream, to collapse, to rage. But instead, she whispered, "You can't undo what you did." "I'm not trying to," he said. "I'm only trying to be the kind of man who would never do it again." For the next week, he didn't ask anything of her. He swept the floors, peeled potatoes, played checkers with the innkeeper's grandson. Some nights, Ivy watched him from the window as he mended a garden fence or read quietly in the corner. She caught him smiling at children, listening to fishermen talk about tides and nets like their lives were poetry. He never looked bored. And she hated that part of her heart, that quiet, traitorous part that still wanted to believe him. One stormy evening, Ivy slipped on the wet dock while helping a guest and sprained her ankle. Jackson was there in seconds, carrying her inside with a gentleness that startled everyone. "You don't have to do this," she murmured. "Who am I?" she said, holding her tighter. That night, while rain tapped on the windows, Ivy sat near the fire, her foot wrapped in cloth, while Jackson wordlessly placed a cup of warm tea beside her. She took it with a nod. He started to walk away. She stopped him. "Why did you cry on television?" Jackson paused. "Because I meant it. Every word." She looked into the fire. "And if I had never seen it?" For a second. "I would have still said it," he answered, "because I owed it. Not just to you, but to myself." For a long moment, there was only the sound of rain and wood crackling in the hearth. Ivy reached out and touched his hand, the one with the faded burn scar she hadn't noticed before. He looked down, stunned. She whispered, "I buried her too." His brows furrowed gently. "Girl I used to be," she continued. "The one who believed in happy endings." Jackson knelt slowly beside her. "Maybe we don't need endings." She met his eyes, vulnerable and scarred and searching. "Baby," she whispered, "we can grieve together." The next morning, sunlight spilled across the inn's small garden. Ivy stood quietly, arms folded, as she watched Jackson crouch near the herbs, teaching the innkeeper's niece how to plant basil. He was laughing, flirted, unguardedly, not like the man she once knew, but someone softer. Real? She hadn't decided yet what that meant. That night, after the guests had gone to sleep and the dishes were done, Ivy found him outside, sitting on a bench, shoulders hunched against the cold wind. She walked over slowly, her ankles still wrapped, and sat beside him. Silence stretched between them like a held breath. He didn't speak, neither did she. Until finally, Ivy said, "Tell me the worst thing you've ever done." Jackson didn't hesitate. "I married you?" She stiffened. He turned to her. "Because it was for a bet. That's what makes it the worst. Not because of you, but because of what I made it mean. I didn't see a person, I saw a punchline." Ivy swallowed hard. "And now?" "See the person I never deserved, who showed me what it meant to be seen, then vanished before I could learn how to see. Back." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I used to be a pianist. Did you know that?" His brow furrowed. "No." Died. "She played at concert halls. Once stood on a stage in Vienna. I was going to be signed to a major label. Then came the engagement, the fire, the scandal." Her voice cracked. "Now my fingers won't even hold a key steady." Jackson didn't respond with pity. He simply listened. "I thought," she continued, "if I could survive the fire, I could survive anything. But I didn't expect to survive shame. Or your voice when you looked at me like I disgusted you." "Remember," he said softly, "and I hate myself for it." A tear slid down Ivy's cheek. She wiped it quickly. "I hated you too," she whispered. "Not just for what you did, but because part of me wanted you to love me anyway, even after everything." Jackson's hand trembled as he reached for hers. She didn't pull away. "I can't rewrite the past," he said, "but if you let me stay, I'll carry the weight of it every single day." She turned to him. "This was never supposed to be a fairy tale." "What do you say for anyone?" Will asked, suddenly alert. "I want a fire that doesn't burn us down." Days passed. Jackson didn't ask for more than Ivy was ready to give. He helped around the inn, brought groceries from town, even fixed the creaky upstairs plumbing. Word got around that a billionaire had settled in their coastal village, but no one believed it. Not when they saw the man sweeping leaves in the alley with a content smile. He wrote her letters, Never gave them, just left them folded under flower pots or beside her tea. Little things. One said, "I saw a sea turtle today and thought of your quiet strength." Another, "I miss the way you hum when you think no one here." They were never intrusive, never forceful. Just pieces of a man rebuilding himself. Then one afternoon, Ivy received a visitor. The woman was older, elegant, dressed in deep navy. She introduced herself as the director of the Burn Survivors Foundation. "We received an anonymous donation in your name," she said gently, "and requests to create scholarships for disfigured women pursuing the arts." Ivy stood frozen. "We'd like to name one of the programs after you," the woman continued, "if you will allow it." Later that night, Ivy found Jackson in the kitchen, baking a pie from scratch, flour on his nose and shirt collar. He looked up sheepishly. "I was trying to surprise you." "You did," she said, voice soft. She walked closer. "You sent them, didn't you?" He didn't deny it. She asked. "Because the world didn't get to keep you, but it can still learn from you." Ivy stared at him, and for the first time in weeks, something cracked open. Forgiveness, not fully, but a beginning. That night, they stood on the porch watching the stars. "Still see her?" he asked quietly. "The girl you used to be." Ivy smiled faintly. "Sometimes, in the mirror. In music I can't play anymore. In firelight." "To you?" he asked, hesitant. "She'd let me meet her?" She took a deep breath. "Only if you're willing to meet the woman she became." He turned to her, eyes glinting with something fragile. "I'm here for all of it," he said. And she believed him. The wind picked up. Ivy reached out, gently touching his hand, the one with the burn scar. "He buried her," she whispered again. Jackson leaned closer, resting his forehead against hers. "Then let's mourn them both," he said, "and build something from the ashes." For the first time since the fire, Ivy didn't feel alone. The morning sun broke across the coastal inn like a quiet promise, but peace was a luxury neither Ivy nor Jackson could afford now. It started with a headline. $5 million, 0 cents, gone wrong. Friends, sue billionaire, Jackson Hart. By noon, every tabloid, news outlet, and gossip blog had latched onto the story like leeches. Cameras circled the inn, reporters shouted Ivy's name, and strangers with smartphones tried to snap pictures through the dining room windows. Ivy sat at the breakfast counter, holding her coffee but not drinking. The cup had gone cold long ago. Across from her, Jackson leaned against the sink, reading the online article silently. His jaw clenched, then released, then clenched again. "Or suing me," he said at last, "for the full $5 million, claiming the bet was binding." She looked at him calmly, but her fingers curled around the porcelain mug. Jackson tossed the phone aside. "I should have seen this coming." That night, none of them thought it would matter. It was just entertainment to them. But now that I've burned the money in their names, they wanted back. Ivy finished for him. He nodded, shame prickling his neck. "They say I broke an oral contract, that I robbed them of winnings." Her lips curled with quiet disbelief. "Because you chose to see a person instead of a punchline." It wasn't just the lawsuit. That night, a second wave of scandal hit. One reporter leaked her real name. Another uncovered her past. The fire, the senator, the court case dismissed. Suddenly, Ivy wasn't just a woman with scars. She was the woman who had survived them. Public curiosity mutated into obsession. When Ivy stepped outside, she was blinded by camera flashes. "Miss Rowan, are the scars real? Did Jackson pay you hush money? Are you cashing in on pity?" The final question, shouted by a woman with a microphone, struck hardest. "Are you still just the beggar he married for a bet?" That night, Jackson found her sitting alone in the dark kitchen, her back to the door. She hadn't touched dinner. Her scarf hung from the hook by the pantry. Her scars were visible, but that wasn't what struck him. It was the look in her eyes, quiet, steady, unyielding. She whispered, "That the man who walked away from me was dead. Are you sure?" He stepped into the light. "I'm sure." "Then let's bury him properly." He sat across from her, unsure what she meant. She reached for her phone and opened her notes app. "Tomorrow, I'm giving an interview." Jackson's stomach dropped. Ivy, for attention, not for revenge, for clarity. She met his eyes. Let them see what survival looks like, what kindness can become. If we hide, they win. If I speak, maybe someone out there with scars like mine will stop thinking they're less than human. He was silent, but his heart thundered. There were no walls left between them, only truth now. The next day, Ivy sat on the edge of a cream armchair, the ocean behind her and a single microphone clipped to her blouse. The interviewer, a woman with kind eyes and a warm voice, began gently. "Speak now." Ivy folded her hands in her lap. "Because silence once almost killed me." She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She told her story with clarity, how love had turned to betrayal, how fire had taken her face, how the world treated her like a cautionary tale instead of a person. And then she spoke about Jackson, not as a billionaire or a mistake, but as someone who had changed. "I don't forgive cruelty," she said, looking into the camera, "but I believe in healing, and healing takes truth. He hurt me, but he also stayed, not because I demanded it, because he became the kind of man who could." The clip went viral overnight. From poster. Turn slowly. Turn to the mirror again. Wife wasn't the joke. The bet was, Avery Rowan teaches the world what forgiveness looks like. That same week, the court case played out in sharp suits and cold contracts. Jackson's lawyers argued that no written agreement ever existed. The plaintiffs, his former friends, claimed it was a gentleman's deal and therefore enforceable. The judge, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair, studied both sides with unmoving eyes. Finally, after 3 days of arguments, she delivered her verdict. "We were no binding contract," she said, voice firm, "but even if there had been, I would not uphold it. This bet was morally bankrupt, and rewarding it would set a dangerous precedent." Case dismissed. Jackson exhaled. For the first time in months, his shoulders lowered. But victory didn't taste sweet. Not until he saw Ivy smiling again. Days later, Ivy was offered a 7-figure book deal. Publishers called her a hero. Talk shows begged for her. One even suggested a documentary. But Ivy declined them all. Fame was never her goal. Healing was. And so she stood with Jackson in front of an old red brick building on the outskirts of town. The "For Lease" sign was barely legible. Steve smiled. "This is where we begin, again." He grinned. "The Ivy Rowan Center for Survivors." She shook her head. "Just the haven." Inside, they began work, removing broken tiles, repainting chipped walls, setting up a community kitchen, therapy rooms, and a garden out back for peace and reflection. Jackson funded every dollar. Ivy donated every hour. Their scars didn't fade, but they bloomed into something bigger than pain. Word spread fast about the haven. At first, it was just a handful of visitors, women with quiet voices and nervous eyes, men who limped with invisible wounds, teens with hunched shoulders who said nothing at all. They came for the garden, the warmth, the unspoken promise that no one here would flinch. Ivy met every one of them with the same quiet grace. She never asked what they survived. She only asked what they needed. Jackson installed benches in the shade and made sure there were always warm meals in the kitchen. He fixed the leaky roof himself, climbed ladders with blistered hands, and laughed when Ivy caught him with paint on his face. "This place feels like a person," he once said, "like it's breathing." "Maybe it is," Ivy replied, planting a seedling. "Maybe it's all of us." Still, not everyone welcomed the change. Reporters still camped across the street, desperate for drama. Headlines churned with speculation. Ugly bride turns activist. Billionaires fall from grace or rise to redemption. One night, as Ivy locked up the front doors, she caught sight of a teenage girl lingering at the fence. The girl had burn marks along her neck and kept her hoodie pulled high. Ivy stepped out. "Hi," she said gently. The girl hesitated. Is it true that you married that guy for a bet?" Ivy said calmly. "But I didn't know it at the time." "You stayed?" Ivy said. "I left, and then he chose to find me, not because he had to, because he changed." The girl bit her lip. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Ivy smiled. "The door's open." Moments like that became the true legacy of what they'd built. Not the interview, not the lawsuit, but the quiet ways broken things could be mended. One morning, weeks later, Jackson stood at the back of the Haven's garden, watching Ivy speak to a small crowd of survivors. A new workshop was starting, art therapy for scars. A local painter had donated easels, and Ivy had brought her own journals from years ago, filled with ink and ash. Jackson watched her with awe. Her scars no longer defined her. If anything, they gave others permission to breathe easier. He thought back to that rooftop party, the clinking glasses, the cruel laughter, the emptiness disguised as opulence. He didn't even recognize the man he was then. But he knew exactly who he was now. Later that night, as the stars hung low and soft over the inn, Ivy found Jackson in the garden, kneeling beside a row of fresh herbs. She sat next to him, silent for a moment. "You've memorized every plant in here." "I needed something to tend," he said, "something I couldn't buy or fix, just learn." She tilted her head. "You've changed." He glanced at her, eyes full of quiet certainty. "You changed me." Ivy looked down at her hands. "Sometimes I still wonder if I'm enough, if people see my face and pity me instead of hearing what I say." "Strength," he replied. "I see fire that refused to go out." A silence stretched between them, warm and safe. Then Ivy reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I was going to wait, but this came today." She handed it to him. He unfolded it, brows raising. A permit. Official approval for the expansion of the Haven across 3 new towns. He blinked. "You're serious?" She nodded. "There are more stories out there, more people who need a place to begin again, and I want to help them write it." He smiled slowly. "Then let's build it, brick by brick." They sat like that for a long time, beneath a sky that had once felt distant, but now watched over them like an old friend. Months passed, seasons turned, the Haven flourished. Ivy gave talks, not on stages, but in classrooms, libraries, healing centers. She didn't preach, she shared. Her voice didn't rise, it resonated. Jackson invested quietly in survivor networks. He didn't need headlines, he needed peace. They lived between the inn and the garden, between memory and renewal. And then, one afternoon, as Ivy sat journaling in the sunroom, Jackson came in holding a velvet box. She raised a brow. "We're not doing this again, are we?" He grinned. "No jokes, no bets, just a question." He knelt before her, not like the first time, not out of pride or performance. This time, it was reverence. "I don't want a redo," he said. "I want the real beginning. Will you marry me? Not because you saved me, but because we built something that deserves a future." Ivy blinked back tears. She didn't need a ceremony or a dress. Just him. She whispered, "But only if you promise one thing." He laughed, eyes already wet. "Anything." She leaned forward. "Never ask me to stop planting seeds." He pulled her into his arms. Not a chance. Outside, the garden bloomed. Inside, the past finally exhaled. The morning sun filtered through the curved glass panels of the greenhouse, painting the room in a warm, golden light. Dew clung to the petals of thousands of blooming roses, soft reds, delicate pinks, and creamy whites, each one carefully arranged just as Ivy had dreamed. The scent was overwhelming, not in its strength but in its gentleness, like memory, like healing. She stood at the far end of the aisle, her dress a simple ivory silk that shimmered only when the light hit it just right. No sequins, no veil. Her hair was brushed back, the faint scars near her jaw visible but unhidden. She carried no bouquet. She didn't need to. On either side of the narrow aisle sat survivors from Ivy's healing center. Some wore formal clothes, others wore the marks of their own burns with pride. Staff from the inn, now turned center, stood beside them, their eyes glistening. At the front, seated gently on a bench, was Emery, the little girl Ivy had once saved from drowning, now giggling softly as she clutched a tiny basket of rose petals. At the end of the aisle stood Jackson. He didn't wear a tuxedo, just a navy blue suit and a boutonniere made of wildflowers. His hands were folded in front of him. The scar on his right hand was faint, almost gone now, but Ivy noticed it, just as she always did. His eyes never left hers as she began to walk, barefoot, on the moss-lined path between the rows of roses. There were no cameras, no press, no luxury guests flown in by private jets. Just the people who had seen them both at their lowest, and still stayed. When Ivy reached him, she exhaled slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "No more hiding." Jackson's eyes welled. "You taught me how to love, not in spite of pain, but through it." The officiant said nothing for a moment, sensing the sacredness of silence. Then gently, he began, "Today isn't a wedding. Today is a renewal, a rebirth, not of a relationship made for the world, but one that defied it." Ivy didn't speak during the ceremony. She simply watched Jackson with calm clarity, her hands warm in his, the weight of the last year pressing softly into her chest. The lawsuits, the headlines, the betrayal, the healing, they'd survived it all, but this moment wasn't about survival. It was about present. When it came time to say their vows, Jackson went first. "I once thought love was something you earned by being impressive, being untouchable. But then I met a woman who wore her pain like poetry and tended to broken things without asking why they shattered. Ivy, I marked what I didn't understand. I broke what I should have protected. But you stayed, even when I didn't deserve it. And now, I vow this, I will never walk ahead of you, never behind you, only beside you, always." A murmur passed through the greenhouse, not applause, just breath, full of awe. Ivy raised her gaze. Her voice, when it came, was as soft as a lullaby. "There was a time I thought my story ended in ash, that I was a ruin no one would return to. But then you came, Jackson, not as a rescuer, but as a mirror, showing me the parts of myself I buried. I don't need perfect love, I just need truth, and today I vow to give you all of mine. The broken, the beautiful, and everything in between." As the final words were spoken, Emery skipped forward and handed them a small wooden box. Inside were 2 simple rings, no diamonds, no glitter. Ivy slipped his on first, he followed. They turned to face the guests. The officiant smiled. "Then, by no power vested in me, because you gave it to each other long ago, I bless this bond." Laughter sparkled through the air as the guests clapped. The reception was held just beyond the greenhouse, in the open garden, under canopies of golden fabric and twinkling lights. Tables made of reclaimed wood were adorned with soft cloth, bowls of fruit, and vases of herbs and wildflowers. Children ran barefoot. Musicians played gentle strings near the far hedge. At the center of the garden stood a modest screen, flickering with light. Ivy stepped forward with a small remote in her hand. She looked around, suddenly shy, until Jackson touched her elbow gently. She nodded, then pressed play. A video began. There was no introduction, no music, just faces, burned survivors from around the world speaking into the camera. One woman said, "They called me a monster, but I made it through." A man whispered, "She held my hand when I wanted to disappear." A child giggled, "Miss Ivy taught me I'm not scary, I'm magic." Then came images of the center, hands planting vegetables, painting walls, braiding hair. Laughter, tears, healing. The video ended with Ivy's voice. "We are not our burns, we are our rebuilding." When the screen went black, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. A woman stepped forward, holding a small harp. Another read a poem. No one rushed, no one interrupted. This was a celebration written by time, not spectacle. Emery, barefoot and glowing in a pale lavender dress, ran into the open space and twirled. then reached out her arms. "Dance with me, Ivy." Ivy laughed, barefoot too, and joined her. They twirled together, child and woman, scarred and whole, each reflecting the light back to the other. "You're the most beautiful person I know," Emery whispered as she leaned her head on Ivy's chest. Ivy kissed her hair, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. And from the corner of the garden, Jackson watched, arms folded, eyes soft, his heart finally still. The night slowly descended into golds and ambers, the sun dipping beneath the trees. But the celebration was far from over. Each guest was given a lantern paper and shaped like stars. When Ivy stepped into the center again, holding a lantern with Jackson by her side, she took a long breath. "Was a time I feared being seen. Today, I choose to be." One by one, the guests lit their lanterns. Then together, they released them into the sky. They floated upward, glowing like hope, like forgiveness, like everything Ivy had once been told she'd never have. She turned to Jackson as the last lantern rose. "I was never a beggar," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jackson cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing the edge of a faded scar. She smiled. "I was waiting to be chosen for who I was." He kissed her forehead, holding her against his chest. And for the first time, Ivy let herself be held without flinching. Later that night, long after the guests had left and the lanterns had faded into distant stars, the greenhouse stood quiet again. Ivy walked barefoot along the stone path where she had made her vow, trailing her fingers across the roses now sleepy in moonlight. The petals felt like velvet, soft against her skin. Behind her, faint laughter echoed from the distant cottage where the survivors were resting, and where Emery had finally fallen asleep, curled up with a stuffed owl someone had gifted her. Jackson appeared silently behind her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to her without a word. She took it, fingers brushing his. Neither of them spoke for a while. The night didn't need words. It hummed with the weight of everything unsaid. "You bloomed," Ivy finally whispered, nodding toward the roses. "I didn't think they would. Not in time." "I waited for you," Jackson replied, "just like I did." She smiled into her cup, the steam curling around her face. "Do you remember," she asked softly, "the first night you saw me without the scarf?" "Remember everything," he said. "Every mistake, every silence I should have filled." She turned to him then, her expression gentle, not accusing. "We can't erase the pain, Jackson, but we can honor what came after." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a folded piece of charred paper. "I found this in your notebook," he said, carefully opening it. It was addressed to someone named Miriam. Ivy's breath hitched. "My sister?" The name hung between them, suspended in memory. "She died in the fire," Ivy said, "but I used to write to her anyway. Letters I never sent. Words I was too afraid to speak to anyone else." Charlie 27. "I read the one where you said, maybe love isn't about who stays when we're beautiful. It's who stays when we've become someone else." Tears slipped down her cheek. "That's the one I wrote the night you left." Something easy to relate to. Jackson didn't speak. Instead, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, holding her with the quiet strength of someone who had learned how to be gentle. Ivy leaned into him, not from fear, but from release. "I want to build something," she murmured into his chest. "Something for people like us, people who were told they were too broken to be seen." He pulled back, eyes searching hers. "Then let's build it. Together." They spent the following months turning the old inn into a haven, part wellness center, part home, all heart. Survivors from all walks of life arrived. Some stayed for a week, others for years. Each room was repainted, each garden replanted. Ivy insisted on building a greenhouse just like the one they'd married in. Jackson handled the permits, the construction, even laid down the first tiles himself. And every evening, they sat with the residents, told stories, shared meals. No titles, no cameras, just presence. One day, a young man with severe burns down his neck asked Ivy, "How did you learn to stop hiding?" Ivy looked at Jackson, who was laughing with Emery by the window. Then she answered, "I didn't. I just found someone who didn't flinch when I was done pretending." The healing center became known not for its size, but for its soul. People came from across the country, not just for treatment, but to feel seen. Ivy gave quiet speeches. Jackson worked behind the scenes. Their scars became symbols, not of tragedy, but of truth. On the one-year anniversary of their vow renewal, the local mayor offered to rename the town garden after Ivy. She politely declined. Instead, she suggested they name it after Miriam. "To be more than a victim," Ivy explained. "Let her be something beautiful now." The day they installed the sign, Miriam's garden, Ivy and Jackson stood before a small crowd. Emery tugged at Ivy's sleeve and whispered, "She'd be proud of you." Ivy smiled. "I hope so." That night, back in their cottage, Ivy found Jackson sketching something on a napkin. "What's that?" she asked, sliding beside him. "Mental health support. For a new wing at the center, for kids." Ivy took the pen from his hand and added a heart to the corner. "Let's name it after Emery." Cast his group on his legions for self-him cry, he chuckled. "She'll dance," Ivy corrected. "She always dances when she's happy." Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and the scent of roses wafted through the window. "Where you can see it?" Ivy asked suddenly. Jackson didn't answer immediately. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I miss the illusion," he said finally. "That money made me invincible. That cruelty was power. But not the life itself." Ivy nodded. "Me neither, though sometimes I miss the girl who believed love wouldn't hurt." He turned to her, lifting her chin gently. "She's still here, but now she has armor made of every heartbreak she survived." Their kiss was quiet, reverent. Not rushed, not fiery, just real. Later that week, Ivy received a letter from a publisher offering her another book deal. She held it in her hands for a long time, then finally said, "The world doesn't need my story in print. They need the space to write their own." She tore the letter up and tossed it into the fire. Jackson watched her, admiration in his gaze. "You're the bravest person I know." "I'm just someone who stopped running," she said, and turned toward the light. On their next vow anniversary, they didn't host a party or hold a ceremony. Instead, they spent the day tending the garden. Ivy planted a new rose bush. Jackson fixed a loose panel on the fence. Emery chased butterflies across the field, her laughter echoing like wind chimes. That night, as the stars appeared and the porch creaked beneath their rocking chairs, Ivy turned to Jackson and whispered, "Did you ever think this would be our ending?" "Yes," he said, "but I hoped." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Then, let's keep rewriting the ending. Every day." And as the moon cast its glow over the fields, the scars they bore shimmered, not as wounds, but as reminders of the fire they walked through, together. The manor stood tall on the hillside, its stone walls washed in soft morning light, its windows wide open to the wind that carried the scent of rosemary and rain-soaked earth. Once abandoned and overrun by weeds, the place had been nothing but ash and echoes. But now, with every beam restored, every brick carefully laid by both architects and survivors alike, it had become something more than a building. It had become. The Jackson and Ivy Foundation Healing Center officially opened on a spring morning so quiet it felt sacred. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no paparazzi, just a circle of survivors, staff, and volunteers standing hand in hand in the courtyard while the sun poured golden warmth over the stone floor. Inside, the walls were alive with faces, portraits of burned survivors painted by other survivors. Ivy had insisted on them. She should see themselves as art, she'd said, because they are. Each hallway had a name: hope, courage, renewal. On the door to the main classroom where Ivy taught creative therapy and resilience workshops, a small wooden plaque simply read, "Ashes to Garden." In that classroom, Ivy stood before her first group of students, a mix of teens and adults, each at different stages of recovery. Some wore compression garments, others had faces newly touched by grafts. Most were silent, unsure, staring at her with guarded eyes. Ivy began, not with a speech, but with silence. She sat with them, waited. Then, softly, she whispered, "The world once told me I was too broken to be seen. I'm here to tell you that they were wrong." A teenage girl in the back lay loud a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Over the weeks, Ivy's class became a sanctuary. They painted scars into rivers, danced their nightmares into dust, turned journals into confessions no one judged. She never asked them to heal quickly, she only asked them to stay. Meanwhile, outside the classroom, Jackson spent his days with soil under his nails. He'd chosen the garden as his domain, not to escape, but to rebuild in his own way. He learned how to prune roses without wounding the buds, how to coax tomatoes from stingy vines. He often worked with the younger survivors, those who weren't ready to speak but who found comfort in the quiet work of growing something. There was a boy named Theo, 10 years old, who had barely spoken since the accident that burned his arms. Jackson didn't ask him to talk. He handed him a trowel and showed him how to plant tulip bulbs. Weeks later, Theo tugged Jackson's sleeve and whispered, "They'll bloom, right?" Jackson nodded. "Even if we don't see them right away, they bloom anyway." In the afternoons, Ivy and Jackson met on the bench beneath the olive tree they had planted together. Sometimes they brought tea, sometimes they just sat in silence, always hand in hand. One afternoon, Ivy brought out a sketch pad filled with designs. "Want to build a greenhouse for the center," she said. "One with sliding panels, accessible paths, sun everywhere, so they can walk among the flowers no matter the weather." Jackson looked at her, smiled, and replied, "Let's start tomorrow." And they did. That summer, laughter filled the center's halls like music. Survivors painted murals in the dining room. Children ran barefoot across the lawn. Volunteers from all over came to help, some doctors, some artists, some burn survivors themselves. One evening, Ivy found Jackson asleep under the arbor with a toddler nestled against his chest. The child had arrived just days earlier, rescued from a shelter after being abandoned because of his facial scars. He had cried for hours until Jackson picked him up, whispered something only the child could hear, and carried him through the garden until the boy fell asleep. That night, Ivy sat beside Jackson at their cottage's small kitchen table. "He didn't even flinch when he saw your scars," she said. Jackson looked into her eyes, "Because you showed him they weren't something to fear." They adopted the boy later that fall, named him Elias. Curious passed quietly, not uneventfully, but softly, like petals falling one by one into a full bloom. When Ivy turned 40, Jackson built her a garden library, shelves lined with books donated by survivors, stories that once lived in silence. Ivy added her own journal to the collection, its cover embroidered with gold stitching, its title simple, "The Light After." At the back of the book, in a sealed envelope, she included a letter addressed not to Jackson or her children, but to someone she hadn't yet met. The envelope read, "To my grandchild, if ever I am blessed to have one." In the letter, Ivy wrote, "It was a time when the world set me on fire. I thought I would die in those flames, but somehow I lived. I didn't rise to burn others, I rose to light the way. The scars you may hear about are not my shame. They are my survival. Let them remind you that beauty doesn't ask for permission to exist. It simply does." She signed it in her steady, deliberate handwriting. "Your grandmother, Ivy Hart." The next morning, Jackson found her reading it aloud to the wind, as if the air itself were listening. In the Healing Center's courtyard, late autumn brought amber leaves and cool breezes. Ivy walked among the roses, her scarf loose around her neck, not to hide, but simply because it was her favorite shade of plum. She stopped beside one of the benches, where a young woman sat weeping quietly. Her name was Pilar, and this was her third day. "Scared they'll never see me the same," Pilar whispered. "Not after what happened." Ivy knelt beside her, gently taking her hand. "Then let them change," she said. "You are not the one who needs fixing." Pilar looked into Ivy's eyes, and for the first time, didn't look away. Inside, Jackson was helping Pio, now 15, paint a new sign for the garden entrance. The wood smelled of pine and varnish, and the boy's brush trembled only slightly. "Should we name it?" Theo asked. Jackson tilted his head, thoughtful. "Your call." Theo hesitated, then smiled. "The Garden of Second Chances." Jackson nodded. "Perfect." They hammered the sign into the soil just before dusk. Ivy stood beside them, her heart full in a way she hadn't known it could be. They weren't just building a center, they were growing a legacy. Over time, Ivy and Jackson adopted a second child, a girl named Nari. She had been found abandoned in a shelter overseas after surviving a fire in her village. She didn't speak at first, but she held Ivy's hand tightly when they first met, as if she'd been waiting for her. Years passed, and the center expanded. Ivy taught new instructors. Jackson developed mentorship programs. The couple became known not for wealth, but for something more enduring, compassion carved from hardship. One spring afternoon, Ivy sat beneath the blossoming magnolia tree with Elias and Nari beside her. They were teenagers now, strong and kind. Nari braided flowers into Ivy's hair, while Elias read aloud from one of the library's donated books. "You know what I think?" Nari said. "You and Dad are like those seeds we plant. Everyone thought nothing would grow, but look at all this." Smiley smiled. "We had the right soil, and enough sun." That night, while the lanterns were being hung for the annual celebration of healing, a quiet festival held at the center to honor survivors new and old, Ivy sat alone in her cottage, writing a new letter. She didn't know if her grandchildren would ever read the one she'd written before. So she wrote another, one born from the life she'd lived since. "To the ones who come after me. This garden didn't bloom overnight. It came from years of storms, of pulling weeds, of believing there was still beauty left after destruction. There was a time I was called a beggar, a joke, an eyesore, but the truth is, I was never those things. I was a girl set on fire by someone else's cruelty. And I chose not to turn to. Instead, I chose to root myself in hope. That's what this place is. That's what your grandfather and I became. Not perfect, but real, forged by fire, held together by love." She folded the letter and tucked it into a book. The light after, which now sat on the library's front table with a small wooden plaque reading, "Borrow freely, but return with kindness." Outside, the night sky swelled with lanterns. Survivors and supporters, teachers and children, all stood in a circle, each holding a candlelit lantern. Ivy and Jackson stood at the center. They had made it tradition to never speak at these gatherings, only to release. Ivy looked at Jackson. He still carried the glint of the man he once was, the sharpness, the confidence, but it had softened into something gentler, something earned. He took her hand and kissed the scarred knuckles without hesitation. The crowd began the countdown. 3. The lantern soared. Embers danced upward into the indigo sky, 1,000 little flames that no longer burned to destroy, but to illuminate. Ivy watched the last one rise, then turned to Jackson. "I used to think I was a ghost," she said softly. "Someone only seen in tragedy." He leaned close. "You were never a ghost." She smiled. "I was just waiting for the right place to be real." They walked through the garden together, hand in hand, past the olive tree and the sunflower path, past the greenhouse and the children's corner, toward the manor that had once been a ruin and was now a sanctuary. Their scars showed in the soft moonlight, unhidden, unashamed. Jackson stopped beneath the archway and turned to her. "Tori ordered," he murmured. "You still haven't answered the question I asked years ago." Ivy raised a brow. "Which one? Who the hell are you, really?" She stepped close, pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "I'm the girl who chose to survive, and then decided that wasn't enough." He smiled. "What did you choose after that?" They stood there for a while, not saying anything else. The garden breathed around them. Roses swayed in the wind. The soil beneath their feet was rich, full of old roots and new beginnings. A place made from ashes. A life built from love. and the story of a woman once called a beggar, now remembered as the one who bloomed.